John sank into the lounger beside his pool, letting the warm sunlight seep into his skin. The water rippled gently, the faint scent of chlorine mingling with blooming jasmine from the garden. For John, this was more than just a pool. It was a sanctuary, a place where the burdens of his disability, the aching joints and restless nights, momentarily faded into the shimmering blue. After a long week of doctor visits and therapy, he deserved this quiet escape. The neighborhood was calm, too calm. The usual drone of lawnmowers and distant children's laughter was oddly absent today. John thought maybe the sudden stillness was a blessing, a momentary peace, but then he heard footsteps, sharp, fast, and determined. He looked up just in time to see Karen striding toward him. Karen was the kind of neighbor who seemed to carry the weight of the entire community's rules in her purse. Her tightly curled hair bounced as she approached, her mouth set in a firm, disapproving line. There was no warmth in her eyes, only steel. "John," she snapped, stopping just a few feet away, her voice low but cutting through the silence like a knife. "You can't be using the pool." John blinked, surprised. "Excuse me?" Karen's gaze hardened. "You heard me. The HOA rules clearly state that the pool is off limits to anyone violating federal regulations. And I'm telling you, your usage right now, it's illegal." A chill ran down John's spine. "Illegal? Karen, I'm disabled. I have every right to use my pool. It's part of my home." Karen's lips curled into a bitter smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "That's not what I'm hearing. In fact, I think you're committing a federal violation." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, but the words echoed loudly in John's ears. "I'm calling 911. Before John could react, Karen whipped out her phone, fingers already tapping the screen. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the escalating confrontation, eyes wide with curiosity and unease. They formed a loose circle around the two. John felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't before. The air thickened with tension, every heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Karen, wait," he pleaded. "You don't understand. This isn't about breaking rules. This is about my health, my rights." Karen ignored him, speaking into the phone with practiced efficiency. "Hello, yes. I'd like to report a violation at 12 Maple Street. There's a disabled man using the pool illegally. It's a federal matter." John's breath caught. How could someone be so blind, so hostile? He scanned the growing crowd and caught the concerned glance of a few familiar faces, but others looked uncertain, their expressions shaded with judgment. The sirens came before he could say another word, a harsh wail slicing through the summer air. John's heart leapt into his throat as flashing red and blue lights spun into view at the end of the street. Karen stood tall, triumphant, as the first officers stepped from their vehicles. She pointed at John like he was a criminal, caught red-handed. "He's breaking the law," she told them. "You need to do something." John swallowed his fear, steeling himself. He was not a troublemaker. He was not a threat. Yet as the police approached, he knew this encounter would change everything. Was this just about a pool? Or had Karen unleashed something far more dangerous? A battle for dignity, justice, and the fragile peace of a community on the brink. The officers approached cautiously, their expressions neutral but alert. John straightened up, trying to steady his nerves. He met their eyes and spoke calmly. "Good afternoon, officers. I'm John Miller. I have a disability, and this pool is part of my home. I'm fully within my rights to use it." Karen, standing just a few steps away, crossed her arms tightly. Her voice was sharp as she interrupted. "He's breaking federal laws. He's using the pool against HOA regulations and endangering everyone. One officer, a young woman with keen eyes, glanced at Karen skeptically, but said nothing. The other officer began asking John to explain, his tone professional, but tinged with curiosity. John showed them his medical bracelet, then pulled out a neatly folded letter from his doctor. This states that my condition requires regular water, therapy. The HOA bylaws also confirm that reasonable accommodations must be made for disabled residents. I'm not violating any laws. Karen scoffed loudly. You expect us to believe that? This is exactly the kind of abuse that ruins neighborhoods. If he can just do whatever he wants, what's next? Everyone bending the rules. John felt the room closing in. Karen's words were more than accusations. They were a threat, a warning to others to keep him out. His neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others whispered among themselves. The younger officer spoke quietly into her radio, requesting backup. Just to be safe, she explained, without meeting anyone's eyes. John's stomach twisted. Why was this turning into something bigger? He glanced at Karen, whose smile was cold and triumphant. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was hunting. A tense silence settled over the crowd. Karen leaned toward John and hissed, "You don't know what you've done. The HOA is already drafting a complaint, and the federal authorities will be involved soon. This will ruin you." John's voice was barely audible. "I've done nothing wrong. This is harassment." Karen's eyes glittered dangerously. "Harassment? No, John. This is protection. Protection for the neighborhood. For order. If you want to keep using that pool, you better think twice." Suddenly, from the edge of the crowd, an elderly woman stepped forward. Mrs. Jenkins was known for her kindness, but today, her face was tight with worry. "Karen, this is going too far," she said firmly. "John has lived here for years and never caused trouble. We should support him, not bully him." Karen turned her glare to Mrs. Jenkins. "Maybe you're too blind to see what's really happening. This isn't about John. It's about keeping our community safe from people who think they're above the rules." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Was Karen right? Or was this an attack on someone simply trying to live peacefully? The tension was electric when a sharp voice broke through the crowd. "Do you realize what you're accusing him of?" a man said, stepping forward. It was David, John's longtime friend and neighbor. "You're talking about federal violations, about lawsuits that could destroy this community. Are you sure about this, Karen?" Karen's smile faltered for a moment, but quickly returned. "I don't need to be sure. I know enough to act. If I don't, who will?" John swallowed hard, sensing the dangerous path this confrontation was taking. The officers looked between the two sides, unsure who was telling the truth. "Sir," the younger officer said softly, "we'll need to review the HOA bylaws and possibly consult legal counsel. Until then, we ask you to avoid using the pool." John's heart sank. "But that's exactly what I'm fighting for. My right to use it." Karen's eyes gleamed. "Exactly." As the police walked away to make calls, John glanced around. The growing crowd. Some faces showed sympathy. Others were tight with judgment. Whispers started again. Rumors already spreading. John realized with a sinking feeling that this battle was no longer just about a pool. It was about control, prejudice, and a community on edge, and Karen was only getting started. The police had stepped back, conferring quietly by their squad cars. But the crowd remained thick and restless. John stood frozen near his pool's edge, the sun now feeling less like a balm and more like a spotlight on his vulnerability. Karen's glare never wavered. Her lips pressed into a tight line, as if daring him to say one wrong word. Then, without warning, Karen pulled her phone from her pocket and pressed a few buttons. "I'm calling 911 again," she announced loudly, her voice dripping with venom. John's chest tightened. "Karen, please. This isn't necessary." She didn't answer him. Instead, she held the phone to her ear, speaking into it with clipped urgency. "Yes, I'm reporting ongoing illegal use of the pool at 12 Maple Street. The man there is violating federal laws, and the HOA is failing to act. I'm requesting immediate assistance." Heads turned toward her. Some neighbors frowned. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere thickened with uncertainty and fear. John took a step forward. "Karen, I have done nothing illegal. This is harassment. Why are you doing this?" Karen's eyes flashed dangerously. "Because you refuse to follow the rules. And because I won't let this neighborhood be ruined by selfishness, disguised as disability." The word selfishness stung sharply. John's voice shook as he said, "My disability isn't an excuse to deny me basic rights." The crowd was now a swirling sea of murmurs and sideways glances. Someone gasped quietly. Another whispered, "What if she's right?" Suddenly, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, then split into a harsh crescendo. More police cars arrived, flashing lights slicing through the peaceful neighborhood like knives. 2 more officers jumped out, their faces serious, eyes scanning the crowd. The neighborhood tension spiked again. The sense of a ticking clock intensified. This situation was spinning out of control. The lead officer approached John and Karen, holding a notebook. "Ma'am, can you please explain the reason for this second call?" Karen's tone was sharp, unwavering. "He's using the pool illegally. It's a federal violation. The HOA isn't enforcing the rules. So I'm asking for help." John quickly interrupted. "Sir, I've shown my medical documents. Explain the reasonable accommodations required by law. This is harassment, plain and simple." The officer nodded, jotting notes, but his eyes flicked uneasily toward Karen. "We'll have to investigate both sides, sir. Until then, please stay calm and avoid any conflict." John nodded slowly, but inside he felt trapped. It was as if the entire neighborhood was watching his every move, waiting for a misstep. Karen, emboldened by the growing police presence, stepped closer to John, whispering loud enough for nearby ears. "You think you can win? This is just the beginning." John's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice steady. "I won't back down." As the officers dispersed to speak with neighbors and review HOA documents on their radios, John's gaze swept the crowd. Faces he had smiled at for years now looked at him with suspicion, or worse, contempt. From somewhere behind, he heard a soft voice. "You're not alone, John." It was Mrs. Jenkins. She gave him a small nod of encouragement, but the damage was done. The neighborhood's fragile peace was shattered, and John knew that the fight for his right to use his own pool was no longer just a personal battle. It was becoming a public war. As the police vehicles rolled away with flashing lights still ablaze, John felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool breeze. The coming days would bring more confrontations, more accusations, and more secrets waiting to be uncovered. And Karen, she was already plotting her next move. The officers returned from their cars, papers in hand and a palpable tension in their posture. John's heart pounded beneath his ribs like a warning drum. This was no routine call anymore. Karen stood close by, arms crossed and eyes sharp as a hawk, watching John like a predator, waiting to strike. The lead officer, Sergeant Morales, cleared his throat and addressed John first. "Mr. Miller, we've reviewed the HOA's bylaws and your medical documentation. However, there is an anonymous complaint alleging that you are operating the pool in a manner that violates safety regulations. John's eyes narrowed. Operating the pool. I don't run a business here. It's my private pool, and as far as safety goes, I follow every rule. This anonymous complaint, do you know who it came from? Sergeant Morales shook his head. That information is confidential. We're here to ensure the safety and well-being of all residents. There have been reports of unauthorized access and potential liability issues, so we must proceed carefully. Karen smiled thinly, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. I told you this wasn't just about rules. It's about safety and order. John felt the walls closing in again. This is a witch hunt. I've never had unauthorized visitors. I'm just trying to live my life. The younger officer from earlier stepped forward, her voice steady but kind. Mr. Miller, we're obligated to investigate any complaint, but we also recognize the importance of protecting your rights. We want to resolve this fairly, John nodded, trying to remain composed. Thank you. As the officers began asking more detailed questions about John's pool setup. Ramps, handrails, safety covers. Karen interjected repeatedly, pointing out supposed infractions no one else had noticed. It's a danger to the community, she insisted. If he can't comply, he shouldn't be allowed near the pool. John's friend David pushed through the crowd to stand beside him. That's ridiculous. John's pool is perfectly safe and accessible. Karen's just trying to stir trouble. Karen shot David a cold glance, but didn't respond. The neighbors watching whispered nervously, uncertainty hanging heavy in the air. Sergeant Morales raised a hand for silence. We will conduct a full review of the pool and HOA policies. Until then, Mr. Miller, please refrain from using the pool to avoid further complications. John swallowed hard, but nodded. He looked at Karen, her smirk like a silent challenge. The officers packed up to leave. Karen whispered loudly enough for John and David to hear. This is just the start. You'll see. John's mind raced. Who had sent the anonymous tip? Why was Karen so relentless? And what did she hope to gain by making his life a nightmare? Later that evening, John sat in his living room, staring at his phone. The neighborhood. Chatter was still buzzing. Rumors, gossip, and warnings. The HOA board was scheduled to meet the next day to discuss the growing controversy. John knew the stakes were rising. The pool that had once been a place of peace was now a battleground, and the real fight, it hadn't even begun. The next morning, the atmosphere at the community center was thick with tension. The HOA board meeting was packed beyond capacity. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another now exchanged wary glances, the air buzzing with whispered theories and hidden agendas. John sat near the back, flanked by David and Mrs. Jenkins. His heart pounded as the meeting began. The HOA president calling the room to order. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she began, voice steady but strained. We're here to address the concerns raised about pool usage and compliance with HOA policies. Karen wasted no time. She stood, her posture rigid and voice sharp. This isn't just about one man's pool usage. It's about the integrity and safety of our entire community. I have reason to believe that Mr. Miller's actions threaten both. A murmur rippled through the room. John felt a cold sweat break out. What reason could Karen have that she hadn't revealed? David stood up to speak. Karen, these accusations are baseless and hurtful. John has always complied with the HOA rules and deserves respect. Karen's eyes flashed. Respect is earned, David, not given freely, and I have lived here longer than either of you. I have seen what happens when people disregard the rules. It starts small, but soon spirals out of control. Her words hinted at something darker. a history no one dared speak of openly. The room fell into a heavy silence. Then, unexpectedly, the HOA president cleared her throat and gestured toward Karen. Karen has asked to share some information about past incidents that might provide context. Karen's expression hardened, but she nodded. There was an incident. Karen began slowly. Several years ago, involving a pool accident. A child was injured due to negligence by a resident who ignored safety protocols. It nearly destroyed our community's reputation and led to costly lawsuits. Gasps echoed. The memory seemed to hang like a shadow over the room. Since then, Karen continued, the board has worked tirelessly to enforce rules and prevent any similar incidents. I fear that lax enforcement now threatens to undo all we've achieved. John felt a chill. The accident had happened years before he moved here. Yet Karen's words painted him as the next danger, the next target. Mrs. Jenkins stood, voice firm but gentle. John has shown nothing but responsibility. This community should support him, especially when he faces unnecessary hostility. Karen's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Jenkins, with all due respect, this isn't personal. It's about protecting everyone. If we make exceptions, where does it end? David shook his head in disbelief. It ends with discrimination, and that's unacceptable. The debate spiraled, neighbors taking sides. The room was charged with suspicion, fear, and unresolved resentment. After the meeting, John walked outside with David and Mrs. Jenkins. Why is Karen so obsessed with this? John asked quietly. David shrugged. I've heard whispers. Karen had a falling out with the previous HOA board over some personal issues. She's been trying to regain control, and you're caught in the middle. Mrs. Jenkins nodded. She's using fear to rally support, but it's tearing us apart. John looked back toward the community center. The weight of the evening pressing down on him. The fight was no longer just about a pool. It was about power, history, and something much darker lurking beneath the surface. He knew the battle ahead would demand everything he had, and maybe more. That evening, John's phone buzzed with a message from David. Meet me at the park pavilion. We need to talk. Important. The simple text sent a ripple of unease through John's chest. The quiet war waging in his neighborhood was escalating, and every move felt like stepping into a minefield. Under the cover of twilight, John arrived. At the pavilion, David was already there, pacing nervously. The park was nearly empty, but the streetlights cast long shadows that flickered like warnings. David glanced around before speaking in a low voice. John, I found something. I dug into the HOA records. Old emails, meeting minutes, even some private correspondence. John's brow furrowed. What did you find? David hesitated. Karen's involvement in past disputes goes deeper than anyone knew. She wasn't just enforcing rules after that pool accident. She pushed to change policies in a way that gave her more power on the board. Some people weren't happy, and she made enemies. John's heart quickened. Enemies? Who? David lowered his voice even further. One of the former board members resigned abruptly after a serious disagreement with Karen. There were rumors of threats, intimidation, and now, with you in the middle of this, it looks like Karen's trying to use you as a pawn. John swallowed hard. But why me? What do I have to do with her power struggle? David shrugged. You're the perfect scapegoat. Vulnerable, visible, and someone she can rally the neighborhood against. If she can convince enough people you're a threat, she solidifies her control. John's mind raced. The pool, the accusations, the anonymous tip, all part of a calculated plan to isolate him. What can we do? John asked, feeling the weight of the battle ahead. We need allies. David said firmly, Neighbors who see through Karen's tactics. We also need to gather evidence of her harassment. Record conversations. Document incidents. If this goes to court, it won't be just your word against hers. John nodded, determination hardening his resolve. I won't let her win. Just then, a rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. Both men turned sharply. A figure stepped. Into the dim light, it was Mrs. Jenkins. I overheard everything, she said quietly. You're not alone in this. I've seen the way Karen operates. She's been bullying others for years. John felt a surge of relief. Thank you for coming. Mrs. Jenkins smiled faintly. We must be careful. Karen's influence runs deep. But together, we might just have a chance. As the three of them stood under the flickering streetlights, a new sense of hope mingled with the growing danger. The neighborhood was divided, the lines drawn in shadows and suspicion, but John was ready to fight, not just for his pool, but for his dignity, his community, and the truth. The following days were a blur of whispered meetings and covert plans. John, David, and Mrs. Jenkins worked quietly, documenting every interaction with Karen. John's phone became a lifeline, recording her sharp words and confrontational tone whenever she confronted him or approached the pool. One afternoon, as John checked his phone, a notification popped up. A message from an unknown number. Meet me tonight at the old gazebo near the park. I have something you need to see. Come alone. John's pulse quickened. The message was anonymous, but the timing was suspicious. Was this a trap or an opportunity? Against his better judgment, curiosity won. That night, John arrived at the gazebo, heart pounding under the moonlight. The park was silent, shadows pooling around the weathered wood. From the darkness, a figure emerged. A young woman, eyes wary but determined. I'm Emily, she whispered. I live 2 streets over. I've seen what Karen's been doing. You need proof. John nodded, heart racing. Emily handed him a small USB drive. These are videos and recordings from the HOA meetings, and some private conversations where Karen admits to orchestrating complaints and manipulating the board to increase her power. She's been playing everyone. John's hands trembled. This was exactly what he needed. Emily continued, I've been afraid to come forward because Karen can be ruthless. But if you expose her, maybe things will change. John felt a surge of gratitude and a heavy weight of responsibility. Thank you, he said quietly. This could change everything. As Emily slipped away into the night, John tucked the USB drive safely into his pocket. The fight was far from over, but now he held the key to turning the tide. The next day, John met with David and Mrs. Jenkins. Together, they watched the videos. Karen's own words unraveling her carefully constructed facade. The evidence was damning. David shook his head in disbelief. We have to bring this to the HOA and the police. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, eyes steely. But we must be cautious. Karen won't go down without a fight. As John prepared to make his move, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was already watching, waiting to counterattack. The stakes had never been higher. John knew the next HOA meeting would be the most important one yet. Armed with Emily's recordings and the support of David and Mrs. Jenkins, he prepared himself for a confrontation that could make or break the future of the neighborhood and his own peace of mind. The community center buzzed with an unusual energy. Faces were drawn, conversations hushed, and eyes darted nervously. Karen arrived early, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something different in her gaze. Calculation, perhaps, or desperation. When the meeting was called to order, John rose, feeling every pair of eyes settle on him like a spotlight. He began calmly. I have evidence to share that will clarify the truth about recent events. It's time to bring transparency to this community. As he connected his laptop and played the videos, Karen's confident mask began to crack. Her own voice filled the room, admitting manipulation, threats, and a calculated campaign to consolidate control over the HOA. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some neighbors gasped. Others exchanged glances of shock and betrayal. Just as Karen opened her mouth to respond, the door creaked open, and in stepped Mr. Reynolds, the former HOA board member who had resigned abruptly years before. "I couldn't stay silent any longer," he said firmly. "Karen's actions have been a poison in this neighborhood. I resigned because of her tactics, but now it's time to set things right." Karen's face paled, her eyes flickering with something like fear. Mr. Reynolds pulled from his pocket a folder filled with letters and documents, official complaints, emails, and witness statements detailing Karen's harassment and abuse of power. The room fell into stunned silence. The HOA president stood, her voice strong. "Based on this new evidence, the board will immediately suspend Karen's privileges and launch a formal investigation. We will also implement new policies to ensure no resident is unfairly targeted again." Karen's defiance faltered. She looked around at the faces, once loyal, now resolute against her. John felt a cautious relief wash over him. The nightmare that had gripped his life was finally unraveling. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached John with congratulations and apologies. The community, fractured but hopeful, began the slow process of healing. Later, John stood by his pool, the water shimmering in the afternoon sun. He touched the edge gently, a symbol of the hard-won victory and the promise of peace. But as he turned to head inside, his phone buzzed with a new message. From an unknown number. "This isn't over. You haven't seen the last of me." Jono smiled faintly. The fight for his rights and his neighborhood was far from finished, but this time he was ready.